So hello everybody, my name is Aura Raulo, and I will tell you a little bit about myself in a bit, but first I wanted to say that I'm really excited that so many of you showed up. I just heard that we overbooked this event because we assumed so many will not turn up, but then actually everybody turned up, so that's why we are quite full today. But thanks for coming, I'm really excited to see you here. I will be talking to you today about death from a perspective of ecology, and from a perspective I tend to call queer ecology, and I'm not alone, there are other people who use this term as well, and I will tell you soon what I mean with that. So first of all, who am I? Just to position myself a little bit. So I am an ecologist and an evolutionary biologist working in Oxford University at the moment. In my kind of normal day-to-day life, I actually study the social networks of wild mice. So I'm like a wild mouse specialist. So with all that authority, I'm here to tell you about what dying means. But mice die a lot as well, so I've learned a fair bit about attitude towards dying from them as well. But actually, I have another career as well, which I call I'm like an artist and a writer, but it all circulates around these ideas of networks, these philosophies around networks, and how can we like kind of think about different aspects of our life and death and our society differently if we see ourselves as part of networks, social networks, ecological networks, transportation networks, economical networks. I truly believe it has the power of revolutionizing how we see ourselves as part of the systems we live in, because we are, as a culture, quite much living an era of categorization. We have the hundreds of years of science and philosophy and also art dedicated for defining categories, identifying through categories like like names, like gender, like species, like nations. And these are really useful categories. I'm not against them. How can we measure things if we can't know what we're counting? But I also want to possess the kind of critical idea that just because we have chosen to think of world as consisting of certain categories, for example, we look at nature and we say it consists of species, which consists of individuals, which consists of cells, which consists of genes. This is just possibly one way we have chosen to see the structures of life. And it's a handy way, it's a very useful way, but there are other ways, and there are specifically other ways that can reveal us something we cannot otherwise see. For example, interactions between things. So for as long as we categorize the world as consisting of separate units, like species, a lot of the dynamics, a lot of the things that are happening around us remains invisible. And the same thing you can think of social situations. If I knew all of you in this room individually, I still would know nothing about the social situation in this room, because social relationships, social phenomena do not actually, they're not very well described by people's personalities. They are described by the emergent magic of what happens between two people when they meet. And all of this I'm saying because I'm mostly interested in networks and the narratives of individuality in these categories, because I think that no matter how fancy mathematical models or how beautiful stories we tell up to understand our world better, it all starts from thinking about what are the players in this game board, what are the characters of this story, what are the units that actually matter, that we should pay attention to. And I think it's also something that both the narratives, the stories that make the world go around, and the mathematical models that we scientists use to analyze things depend on. We have to be able to decide on what structures we see in this world. And I will, this is, I think, a very good starting point for talking about death. And I think death is also an amazing gateway for talking about structures of life. because death actually per se is one main defining feature of the structure of how we live and what kind of shape or form our life takes. That actually, for example, our individuality, the fact that we are separate from each other, in some ways biologically depends on our ability to die. And I'll tell you more about it in a bit. One last thing I wanted to say about myself is that I am in a really heavy state at the moment, because I'm quite late pregnant. And so in addition to death, I'm thinking about renewal of life, quite for very personal reasons at any given moment. And just like dying, it's also quite a painful process. So despite all the happiness I feel for it, my back is actually really broken and I can hardly stand. So at some point I need to probably sit on this chair, and I apologize for taking the stance of like a 20th century male philosopher preaching to you from an armchair, but it's the only thing I might have to do because of my back. Well, at least early 20th century, no pregnant woman would have ever been preaching to anyone from an armchair, but so some progress has happened. So let's start from when we think about dying. First, we probably think about the death of an individual, perhaps the death of ourselves. That's probably one of the main defining features of all human cognition, religion, philosophy. The very existence of human mind, in a way, according to many anthropologists, depends on the notion of mortality. That's the starting point of us asking questions. That's the starting point of us wanting to tell stories, wanting to make meaning out of this world. The notion that life is not unending, that we all are going to die. And that in our culture, that's generally considered a little bit of a tragedy. So it's a sad thing. Comes with grief, comes with fear. We are scared of dying. I probably can safely say all of us are a little bit scared of dying, at least I am. And I wanted to put this painting here because this is from not Middle Ages, but almost from Middle Ages, so very long ago, from Hans Holbein. It's called The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb. And this is a painting that features in Dostoevsky's book, The Idiot, as an example of a piece of art that can make you lose your faith. It's very dramatically said. They say that just looking at this painting, then Jesus Christ there is so dead that you will lose your faith in the eternal life promised in Bible. And I can really see that, especially in the 16th century, how much power this kind of painting can have. That someone who's supposed to be the son of life, live forever, looks like this, like extremely dead. And then, of course, there's an immense amount of even more dramatic art about death and how we want to think about it and dwell in it and kind of freak ourselves out with it, because just that feeling of death being near also makes us feel more alive. It makes us feel more like there's a meaning in life. But this is just one way of thinking about death, and this is actually not only just a human way, it's just a kind of a very culturally restricted way of thinking about death. There is, for an eyes of an ecologist, there is a dozen other ways of thinking about dying. There's a diversity of ways of dying, just like there's a diversity of ways of living. And here are some examples that are my own favorites. So there's this so-called immortal jellyfish, which is one of an example of an organism that doesn't really die, or at least doesn't have to die. It has this developmental phase where it is a child, and like all animals, and it grows older, becomes sexually mature, maybe reproduces, then becomes old, and as soon as it reaches senescence, like it's very old, then it starts like developing backwards, becomes young again. And then it becomes child again, and then it starts growing an adult again. And so far, it can't just keep going and, in a way, be immortal, although most of the times these days, these guys tend to still die because they get stuck in the turbines of some cruise ships in Mediterranean. So violent death is still an option for them. But it's not like they have to die. And immortal jellyfish are, of course, like everybody is very interested in them, like, why are they like that? But I think for an evolutionary biologist, when something is strange like that, the main question that arises is, why is not everybody like that? Why is it so rare to not die? And for an evolutionary biologist, the first answer that comes to mind is that it's probably not a very good way of living, is it? That maybe actually undying is not a great strategy. And maybe there's something about dying that is actually really good because it's very common. So if it is true that we can also not die, but as species we have chosen to, there must be a reason for it. And I'll tell you more about it later. This is like a cliffhanger after cliffhanger after cliffhanger. Then there is a huge range and huge diversity in the span of lives. Like when we talk about, I really seriously dislike it when people use the kind of philosophy in their everyday talk where they say that something doesn't matter because it doesn't last. Like, oh, it's going to end anyway, so it doesn't matter. Like this relationship, we can't stay together because he's moving to Australia, so it's not worth dating. Or like the nature, all the rainforests are going to get destroyed anyway, so it's not worth protecting a single tree. I really dislike that because since when was the value of life tied to unendingness? It's quite the opposite. We usually tend to think that if something doesn't end, it is quite meaningless. And when it is somehow limited, that's when it gets value. Just like when something is rare in space, we think it's more valuable than if it's super common. And as an example of this, some organisms live up to like thousands of years. Here's me with the sequoia tree in North America, the largest existing tree. It's just fallen, it's just died, and it had lived over 4,000 years. And then here is my friend with a mayfly, which can live only one day. And who am I to say that sequoias are 4,000 times 360 times more valuable creatures than mayflies? I don't think the value of their life depends on the duration of their life. And there's even, there's sayings that, even if something lasts for a short while, like the life of a mayfly, it can still be beautiful and it can still be meaningful. And then there's also diversity, not just in the duration, but in the shape of how we die. So here is a Paenobacillus bacterial colony, which grows like this kind of branchy structure, a little bit like a tree, and its way of like growing is that it grows all around, and then when it hits a dead end or there is nothing interesting there, it lets itself die there, and it keeps on living wherever there is some useful resources or something interesting for the bacterial colony. So in a way, it uses dying as a creative way of exploring its environment. And you all, at least the Finnish people here or who have dwelled the Finnish bogs, have seen sphagnum moss, rahkasammal. That's also, I think, a very interesting mode of dying. So they grow on top of their own dying body at the same time as they die. So every sphagnum is constantly growing on top of itself and constantly dying at the same time as it is growing. And then the dead parts of its body become peat, and this can go on for tens of thousands of years, and that's why we have these deep peat layers. So it's a much more continuous and gradual mode of dying. It lacks this kind of tragedy. Like, you can't really paint a tragic picture of sphagnum moss in the same way as you can with Jesus Christ, because, it's just dying all the time. But in a way, we can think of in some ways, we are also dying all the time. We might think that our death is one event that happens in the end of our biological life, but the way we define ourselves, we all have different ways of defining who we are, but it can be based on your identity, your memories, your DNA, your cells. All of that stuff is constantly leaving your body and leaving you, and you are changing constantly. So in that way, you are dying a little bit all the time. In a way that when you actually die, you might be such a different person from when you were born that there's actually nothing left of your born self to die at the moment you die. And I think of that a lot about this person inside of me that I'm very keen to meet soon, and I don't know anything about them. But when they will enter this world, there will be someone. But I doubt that someone is ever going to really die, because they'll change so much before they die that there's going to be a lot of gradual death before that event even happens. And maybe somewhere on that path, there will be also this moment of your child grows and becomes an adult. And in that sense, something like a child dies in a community and an adult is born. And that can be also a source of grief for the parents, for example, the same way as death is. So there are all these like miniature deaths even nested inside our life as well. So I already mentioned this bacterial colony's way of exploring its environment by selectively dying wherever there is uninteresting. And I find this really, really cool. And here are some more examples. There's also slime molds, which are kind of like animals, but they grow the same way as these bacteria, who are a famous research study species for this kind of behavior, so that they can actually solve labyrinths and optimize problems by creatively dying at the right point. So there's this like famous scientific study that, for example, showed that when you make a labyrinth where there's one entrance and one exit, and you make your slime mold grow through the labyrinth, and it needs to get to the exit because, let's say, there's some food or some sugar in the exit. It first grows through all of the labyrinth, just randomly, everywhere. But as soon as it finds the optimal way through the labyrinth, it then kills all of the part of itself that are like on the side paths they're not optimal. So you see it like fills the labyrinth, and then all the dead ends part die, and only the most optimal path remains. And in this way, it can like solve quite complicated puzzles even better than our own cognition, even though it doesn't have any brain or even any neurons. And another study used, actually really cool study, put the slime molds to grow on top of a glass, underneath which they put the map of Tokyo. And then they coated the glass with sugar, such that the sugar concentration on the glass represented the population density on the underlying map of Tokyo. And then when they let the slime mold grow, again, it first grew all around to feed on the sugar nodes. But then, because it then kills the branches of itself that are not useful for transporting sugar from one place to another, it actually ended up this kind of network structure which optimally connects the most high population density areas of Tokyo, which actually almost perfectly matches the metro, the subway map of Tokyo. And where it doesn't, this slime mold actually suggested handy metro lines that you should probably have. Because, you know, like if you can't get from here to here, even though it's a lot of people here who want to go here, maybe you should. So in that way, slime mold has also helped us with traffic design. So, is death an inevitable consequence of life? Is it like in Shakespearean sense, the grand tragedy we all have to suffer as a payment of this beautiful life we are given? Perhaps not, because you can also think of death just like any other phenomenon in a biological system as an evolved mechanism, which probably evolved for a reason, in that we know that you could possibly also not die. So why do we die? Why is it so adaptive? Already in the 19th century, this biologist August Weismann had this theory called Weismann germplasm theory, and Weismann doctrine, where he noted that actually maybe death is just a way of life to organize itself in a way that is good for adaptation, good for adapting into changing environments. He says, death is not, as has been hitherto assumed, an inevitable phenomenon essential to the very nature of life itself, but an adaptation which first appeared when an unending life became disadvantageous to the species. So in a way, something about not dying is disadvantageous to the species. Something about the ability of dying is advantageous. And Björn Kröger, who's sitting there, with whom we have most of these ideas developed. A lot of the content of this presentation is based on our shared work. Also writes in this article, so death belongs to the structure of living and life belongs to the process of living. So it's kind of like flirting with this almost like ancient Greek idea that there is a structure of life. We are all like vessels, like bowls, and then there's some sort of essence of life that flows through us, and that essence never dies. It just changes a bowl. Just like here is a human, and then all of our body is like a network of cells, and then one of these cells will give rise to a new branch, like a branch of a tree, which builds another whole human, which then again, one cell builds another whole human, and in that way, life flows through these branches, from one branch to another, unending, while the branches themselves might vanish or die. And that's also what I think about this little one, like, in a way, genetically speaking, they will be my new branch, but it's not just genes that matter. We can also branch out through ideas, through narratives of life. We can give our stories, our identities to others in a way that let us branch to another vessel of life in a way. And if you now look at the Paenobacillus colony and the slime mold and the Weismann's image of human, they actually do look quite similar in shape. We're all kind of branching. In a way, our life form is not that different from slime molds. We just think of ourselves as separate individuals, but maybe we are just, who knows, maybe slime molds branches think of themselves as separate slime mold branches. But for us, it looks all like one big network, one big tree. And in the same way, we are also part of the same network, the same tree of descendants. We're just branches of the same growth. And in a way, our existence on this planet, we can also think of as a certain process of searching, as a process of creatively mapping your environment, in that we grow everywhere. And then wherever there's no resources, where it's boring and uninteresting, we withdraw. And then wherever there is more to be explored, we grow more. We are like a big fungus on this planet. So why did death evolve? Why is it so adaptive? Well, it's all to do with the generational structure of life. So there is something to be said about sex, individuality, and death all evolving together. And I'll tell you more about it in a bit. But that is just because there are like three different phases of the same phenomenon, which is generations. And something about this thing of like building a body of sorts and then existing in this world and then letting that body die to give rise to another new kind of body that is different, but in some ways similar, but in some ways different, is very, very adaptive. It's a very good way forward in life. And that is because it allows certain algorithm of creativity to exist in evolution. It's the machine that keeps up the creativity of life. It allows renewing of systems, and it allows empty space to emerge. And because for life, especially if you look at it through the eyes of an ecologist, the main limiting resource is empty space. So wherever there is empty space, that's call for new life. Mostly we are limited by lack of space on this planet. So all dying is also a process of birthing empty space. So it's also a creative process, not just a destructive process. It creates variation, it creates empty space, it creates renewing, creative, variable, like space for new forms of life that differ from the old. And why does it need to be creative? Why do we need to change? Why can't we just be all the same? Like I've spent something like almost 20 years in education by now, like ever since I was 7 until I was pretty much 27. I was constantly trained to learn more things, and before then I had to learn to walk and talk and eat my own food and carry my own head and learn new languages and learn new things and become a scientist and learn to treat others well and survive a heartbreak and identify and set boundaries and break boundaries and all these things you learn as a human. And then why should I let all of this learning go to waste and die? Like, why can't I just keep learning and just keep being me? Why do we need to start always anew every time? And this guy is also going to have to start without any knowledge of anything whatsoever and have to learn much of the same stuff I already learned. So it seems a bit like uneconomical. But it's not, because we actually need to do this process of learning everything again, over and over again. Because every time anyone learns to live again, they do it differently. And every time someone learns to live differently, they find a new way of living. And every time there is new ways of living, this variation creates potential for evolution to choose on. It's like making new cards to choose from. And we need that variation to adapt to this world, because the world itself is not stable. It keeps changing. It's a moody lover. Whatever works today is not going to work tomorrow. So we need to keep on kind of constantly changing, constantly learning to live again and again. And why is that? Well, here's a little refresher of evolutionary theory for those of you who haven't thought about it for a while. I don't know what they teach about this in high school or elementary school these days, but this is me teaching you how evolution works. So evolution needs things called heritable variation, selection, and chance, aka randomness. So imagine there are snakes who differ in their color. So some snakes are blue, some are gray, some are black. And that this variation is heritable in the sense that whenever they make baby snakes resemble their parents a bit more than some random other snakes. But there is also a chance element. Whenever a new snake is born, you can't actually tell what kind of snake it is. It's always going to be a little bit random. It's a bit more like its parent than someone else, but it's also quite unique. So if the snakes, they live on this cliff, say a gray cliff, and then a hawk comes by and eats all the snakes it can notice from the cliff. It eats the black snakes because the gray snakes are more like the same color of the cliff, so they go unnoticed. And then the gray snakes, they make baby snakes together because, there's no black snakes left. And then putting together the heritable parental variation and the random chance of sex, the beautiful machine that sex creates, which is marrying chance with some heritable variation, creates a new generation of snakes that is a surprise for everybody. No one knows exactly what kind of snakes they are, but we do know that they're more likely to be gray than the previous generation because all the black snakes were gone. Then this happens again, and then if the hawk now selects the less gray snakes again, we have even more gray snakes. And it happens again and again and again, generation after generation. In the end, we only have gray snakes left. And then maybe the snakes move to a new cliff, which is red. And this whole thing starts again, because now they're all very visible. So we need that random variation to be able to adapt anywhere at any given time. And then we need that heritability to carry on the whatever traits that worked well in life to the next generation. And this generational structure that creates new random variation is the creative machine of evolution. And that is why individuality, sex, and death are interlinked, because we actually need sex to create new individuals that are different from the previous ones, which are surprising. That you can't predict what kind of a child you're going to have. It might be a bit like you, but it's also going to be a completely new kind of person. And then we also need to die to give a chance for these new people to reinvent life, to come up with, to face the selection of life as as their world will put it on them. And then because we have this generational structure, we are like separate individuals, or like we can live as separate individuals. So in that way, it's quite clear for everybody that individuality is a prerequisite of that kind of tragic death that I showed the Jesus painting of in the beginning. Like if we talk about the death of corals or death of sphagnum moss, it doesn't seem so tragic. But also, it's not just individuality that is needed for dying, it's actually dying that is needed for the very existence of individuality. We could not be individuals if we didn't die. And there are good examples of other organisms and creatures out there who do not die like we do and also do not possess individuality like we do. Think about bacteria, for example. They kind of don't die, they just divide. Sometimes they die as well, but they can also just divide forever. And also, it's very hard to say who is an individual in a bacterial lineage. Is it like, or what's the unit of a bacteria? Is it the one thingy itself that divides, or is it the lineage, the branch of bacteria that divide from each other? Similarly, like corals, for example, you literally physically can't say where one individual starts and the other one ends because they grow into each other genetically. They also, or like they can be genetically different but physically attached. And then some things can be also physically different but genetically the same, like clonal, like willow trees, for example, you get the clones growing from the same root. So with trees, especially willow trees, good luck with trying to decide who is an individual and who isn't, because it's a mess. Even I think some, if you look at, I looked at some plant book from early 20th century that was classifying the Swedish and Finnish tree species. And for willows, like pajut, it just said Salix sp. Like it didn't even gave the species Latin name. It just said, they're all a mess. Like, don't even try, categorize them. They all interbreed and hybridize and grow from each other's stem and whatever. Like, you cannot separate the species from each other, let alone the individuals. So sometimes our attempts of categorizing this world really break down because nature just isn't always fitting so well in these very separate, neat categories. Well, but now I've been talking about individual death anyway, or like the individuality and death. But it's not just individuals who die at any rate. Death is also a creative force at different scales of life. And the important notion here is that at every scale of life, from cells to individuals to species to ecosystems, dying on the lower scale allows the higher scale of life to renew. It's like we as individuals, we need cell death. Otherwise, we cannot exist as individuals. So for example, for human embryos who grow like yet again, this my baby, which I'm using as an example all the time, the way we grow fingers is that first we just grow like a fin, like a fish, like a meshy thing. And then all these in-betweens of every finger, all that tissue that has just grown there has to selectively die to make fingers. And the same way, we also grow a tail, and then the tail has to die. And there are many phases in our development that go through this programmed cell death, that our cells are programmed to die in an exact order. And if they go wrong, then the individual dies. Then we cannot survive. So we have to be able to die in an exact right way to grow as a human, and even as an adult. We have to our tissues need to be able to die all the time at the right way, to renew, to grow, and for example, for our wounds to heal. And then there is, in addition to this programmed cell death and dying, there is also an uncontrolled undying, which is if our cells somehow stop dying and start just living their life like, well, I don't want to die, that's called cancer. And that's actually quite detrimental for the individual again. So as long as our cells are okay with dying when they're supposed to die, the individual can stay alive. But then if they, for whatever reason, become selfish and want to live when they're supposed to die, then that's detrimental for the whole individual, and obviously for the cells as well. In the end, they will die because we die. So and this kind of same pattern goes in the next level. So us as individuals, we need to be able to die for the species to evolve. If we stop dying, let's say we invented a new biomedical thing that allowed people to not die ever. Well, obviously, first thing we'd have to do is stop reproducing because we can't fit on the planet. That's a bit sad already, right? We've had just old farts here and no children. That's another question whether people would actually enjoy that. But one thing that would also happen very soon is that we would become outdated. Just like software on your MacBook or on your phone becomes outdated against the challenges of the ever-evolving pool of our enemies. If we stop moving, if we stop evolving, we will be left behind. And the first thing that will probably happen is that some virus will wipe us down because our immune system stops evolving. And that's also the reason why if you would take a mammoth and or find a dinosaur DNA and clone them, they would probably just die of flu immediately. Because there's something about existence that is very time dependent. That we are constantly evolving, moving together here, species with other species, and we can't stop. It's a bit like if you read Alice in Wonderland, there was this Red Queen who said that she has to run constantly to stay at the same place and run faster and faster because the ground underneath her was moving faster and faster. And that is a bit like what life is. It's this constant dance, and you have to participate as a species, as an individual, as an ecosystem. You have to dance with the others, or you're out of it. Because everything leans on everything else. Everything affects everything else. And that's actually something that I will want to criticize about the high school evolutionary biology education. Whenever I read high school biology books, they show that evolution as a process where you have some animals or plants are evolving, and the selective pressures that select them are something like temperature or weather that will come from outside of the system. But actually, majority, 90% of all the selective pressures that select what kind of life is successful are also other evolving creatures. We select each other. So it's not like we are adapting to just temperature or light or whatever geological, physical things. We are constantly adapting on other species. We're adapting to, for example, digest plant material so we can eat plants. We're adapting to resist coronavirus infections so we can stay alive while the COVID virus infects us. And at the same time, plants are trying to adapt by creating more toxic things so we wouldn't eat them. And coronavirus is trying to adapt by becoming maybe better at transmitting from one person to another. But actually, it's not becoming more dangerous because even coronavirus and any emergent new virus quickly learns that it's not a good strategy to kill your host because you're dependent on them. And that's why they slowly become more and more friendly. And just like that, we all adapt to each other. We dance together with our ecological relationships, and sometimes that dance is a bit out of balance. I would say our dance with our ecosystems at the moment is a bit out of balance because we don't listen. We're stepping on the toes of others. It's not very harmonious always, is it? But the thing is that we are here together and we are dependent on the same resources we produce for each other. So we better start paying attention to those interactions, your dance partners. And at the same time, species also need to get extinct for the ecosystems to renew. And this is not to say that the levels of extinction we are facing now are normal, because they are actually higher than the baseline extinction rate that we expect. There's a level of extinction that we expect because new species evolve, take over, old species go extinct. It's the same kind of process as dying, individual death or cell death. It allows the ecosystems to renew. But right now, there's a higher rate of extinction than expected because of human action on this planet. So we are in the middle of a mass extinction wave, in a way. But the interesting thing here is that actually, when you have an old ecosystems can also age. When you have a very old ecosystem, like a rainforest, Amazon rainforest, for example, have been similar for a very long time. They evolve more and more diverse, more and more complex, there's more and more species that specialize in some really niche little thing, like those hummingbirds that can only eat the nectar of this one orchid, you know? And it's not that different from what happens, for example, in industries, where first, when you have a new industry, say, when software development became a thing, or when game industry started, you have like companies doing all kinds of things, and then they start specializing, and then the older the industry, the more niche specialized things are. And you have things like tiny little companies specializing in just producing one component or one piece of software or something. And then when you have an ecosystem where everything is very specialized, it means everything depends on each other. Everything is like in a dependent position. Like the hummingbird depends on the orchid depends on the tree it lives on, so on and so on. It creates this kind of domino effect, house of cards situation that makes the ecosystem as a whole more unstable and likely to collapse. And that is the way ecosystems die eventually. And that allows yet renewing of the whole biosphere. So you can take this to more and more different levels. So all kinds of destruction and dying is also a part of the creative process of life, the renewal of all the living systems we're part of. But now, why I was supposed to talk about queer ecology. What did that actually mean? Well, first of all, I want to say that this whole talk, I kind of wanted to show you another perspective on death and dying, to show you that death is not so black and white as we usually think. That there are shades of gray, some nuances in it. That maybe you don't die like now you're living, now you're dead. Maybe there's like kind of, you can die more or less, or you can die many times, or maybe there's like different ways of thinking about dying. And the reason why this kind of perspective is often lumped under queer ecology or queer theory. There's even now a new emerging social science field called queer death, which only looks at queer aspects of dying, comes from this tradition of queer thinking, which, as you probably all know, originated from questioning the categorical nature of gender. So we started thinking like, okay, maybe it's not just that there are females and males or women and men, but maybe gender is a bit more complex than that. Maybe there are intermediate forms, non-binary people, maybe there's transitions between these. Maybe gender is a construct, cultural construct that varies in different cultures, and maybe there's like ways that we could learn to talk about this that acknowledges the variation, the continuum between these different forms of gender. But queer theory doesn't only deal with gender. The newer forms of queerness also use the same queer thinking to criticize or question other categories, like species or nations or cultures, for example. And for some of them, we have quite strong intuition about their somewhat fluid nature, like musical genres, for example. No one would say they have strict boundaries, that everything either is jazz or isn't jazz. So we know that genres are things, they definitely exist, but they have pretty shady boundaries, they merge into each other, something can be a little bit this and a little bit that. But some of them, like gender and species, we don't have that intuition for. We never talk about the creatures that are like on the boundary of a species. But yet, it's quite important we do, because if we don't, we actually miss huge amount of diversity of life. We don't notice all these intermediate forms and all this diversity just in front of our noses. And that can allow us to see much more of this world that would otherwise be hidden. And that's why I like using this queer idea of queering to also think about death. Like, can we queer the concept of death to be less binary, more continuous? And to do that, I'm going to now show you some examples of how death isn't really black and white. And I'm starting from examples of how it isn't so strictly nested as I showed here. So we think that, okay, cells comprise an individual. When an individual dies, then all the cells should die, right? Well, that's not always true. There are also cell lines that can outlive their individual. famous example is this Henrietta Lacks cell line from a womb of this black woman who lived 70 years ago, and then she died of womb cancer. And then, of course, against her consent or any will, some doctors extracted her cancer cells from her womb and made them into a laboratory line of cancer cells, which have been studied ever since. They still live in the labs all around the world. So in a way, Henrietta Lacks's cells are living still 70 years after her death. And also there are things naturally occurring like this, like transmissible cancers. For example, dogs have this transmissible cancer that, it makes tumors, like cancers do. And then when dogs with the cancer come in contact with other dogs, the tumors can spread to the other dog. And then the DNA in those tumors also spreads. It's just like another dog growing on another dog. And this original dog whose tumors they were is long gone, and we don't even know who he was. But the tumors, they live on, and they spread across other dogs, and they live on. And that makes me question, why is there no more transmissible cancers? That sounds like an amazing way of living. You never have to grow a body. You're never going to die. You can just spread all over the place. And I think biologists don't know. It's a good question why cancers are normally not transmissible, because it would make a lot of sense for them to be. And there's another one in Tasmanian devils, which are these crazy aggressive creatures living in Tasmania. And they have this nasty face cancer. They get like tumors in their face, and it makes them really angry. And then when they meet each other, they're like, I'm so much in pain and I hate everything. And then when they meet each other, they will like attack each other out of just pure spite and annoyance. And they will bite each other's faces, and the tumors will then spread to the faces of the others. So it does happen that cells just like spread from individual to another, even without sex, and grow while the individual dies. And similarly, it's not so easy to say when, like what is an individual, like I said, in some organisms that don't really have individuals like bacteria. So asexual and clonally growing organisms who don't have sex, they also don't have individuality like we do, as I said. And they as well seem to kind of die in a more gradual manner. And I think the interesting thing here is that in these cases we notice that our ability to die is actually semantically dependent on our uniqueness. Because when you have a bacteria that divides into two, and then those keep on dividing, and they create like two lines of bacteria, if they remain completely similar and one of them dies, we don't consider that death. But if they evolve to be different, if they, for whatever reason, through accumulating some random mutations, become two different bacterial lines and one of them dies, then we consider it has died. So in some ways, we think that something can only die when it's reached somehow a divergence, or that it's different from its ancestors, which is, I think, interesting, because that we also don't think that of, for example, identical twin babies, that one of them dies, then it doesn't matter because the genome exists in the other, but we would still be very sad. Extinction is also non-binary in a way that evolutionary lineages, by which I mean like, lineages of parents and children and their children and their children, lineages can live on even when a species goes extinct. And I think this is a pretty important notion, because very often when we look at the history of species, you may see these kind of hat-shaped curves where you say, this was the rise and decline of Tyrannosaurus rex. It came out of nowhere to this planet. It rose to its peak success, and then it declined to its extinction and vanished, never to be found again. But actually, species don't come out of nowhere, and they don't vanish into nowhere. They evolve from other species and into other species. And very often when we look at things in terms of this rise and decline narrative, we don't notice when something actually dies or when it just changes into something else. A good example of this is there was this study that showed that if you look at these marine invertebrate creatures that lived very long ago, called brachiopods, in the bottom of the sea, that all of those species, they rise and decline in these perfect waves, one after another. And then with further inspection, they noticed that is actually the same lineage, that when we measured the rise and the decline of one species or another species, we just stop counting the individuals of the species A to species A and start counting them to species B, because they slowly start looking different, because we're counting fossils, we're counting how they look like. Someone will say this is species A, this is species B. But actually there's all these gradual in-between forms, and just by imposing a categorical limits, or actually on a continuous evolutionary path, we created this scene where we think there's 3 species rising and declining, even though it's actually just the same lineage evolving through different kind of morphologies or different body shapes. And the same is true for so many other things, like when we say rise and decline of Rome. Did Rome actually vanish? I think it's still there. Like still we talk about this rise and decline of civilizations, even though, you know, mostly when we say that the civilizations didn't vanish. And I think it's important to realize this, because sometimes they do indeed vanish, and then if we don't recognize that, then we tend to think that we're living in the world of endings. For example, the Aztec civilization did vanish because they all died. That's very much more tragic than what happened to, say, the 80s hair fashion, which vanished because it was, you know, evolved on, replaced by other things, and it still kind of pops up every now and then. So we have to think like, what is actually vanishing? And then when we look at this world through the eye of static categories, and we say, this is this civilization, this is this culture, this is this nation, this is this species. When we categorize things very rigidly, we end up living in a world of endings. It's a sad world where we have to constantly be losing everything, because we are losing. Every civilization is lost in an instant. Every species is going extinct. Everything is going to die. And if we allow ourselves to use something a little bit more allowing than a rigid category to look at the shape of life, we notice that it's just a process of gradual change. It's not necessarily that bad, or it's okay, there's a little change can also be sad, but it's not the same as everything ending. Similarly to how cells can overlive their individual, species can also outlive their ecosystem. Good example is the European bison, who is like a really much a species of a steppe, of a, you know, like an arrow. And Europe was covered with these huge steppes after the last ice age, and the bison was the king of those ecosystems. But those ecosystems are pretty much gone now. There is like almost nothing left of them, yet the bison still lives on, confused as ever, trying to adapt to forest. Yeah, and then I think one very beautiful example is that actually, if we want to go deep into this end of reconsidering how we structure the life we see around us, we could also say that there are forms of life that are not limited at all to any individuals or genes or species or anything. So if you just look outside with like eyes of a child and see what kind of shapes and forms do you see, you might, for example, see a shape of cat eyes and think, where did that come from? And what is going to happen to that? And instead of thinking about cat as a species, you just think of cat eyes as a form of life. And then you can notice that sometimes these things also live on, inherit the same way as we think of species do. For example, because birds are super scared of cat eyes, they have this imprint in their consciousness of cat eyes as like something really scary. They can carry the image of cat eyes with them. We don't see it, like it's invisible. When we see a bird, we don't see the image of cat eyes. It's kind of like a negative shape. A bit like if you ever done this thing of like pouring plaster on a footprint and then getting like a little foot statue. In this way, the shape of something we can see can exist in a negative form in something else. And in that way, for example, predator eyes can exist as a negative imprint in the minds of a bird. And why that matters is that whenever there is a negative imprint, you can use it to cast to get the same shape back again. And that has also happened because birds then also are predators themselves. And they eat insects. So for example, butterflies that try and avoid being eaten by a bird have then evolved by random chance and selection to look more like cat eyes because they get less eaten by birds that way. And in this way, this shape has imprinted itself on the wings of a butterfly, even though cats and butterflies don't have any direct relationship with each other usually. But it goes through the negative shape inside the bird's mind. So in that way, we can think of ecological relationships also as units of life, the same way as we think of individuals, for example. So now I'm coming to the end of this talk, and this is going to be the network theory part of it, which I promised. So I've been telling you that separating living from the dead can be quite a non-trivial task, because we don't necessarily know or always say where to draw the boundaries of whoever is dying, individual or species. And importantly, if we, alternatively, I want to suggest to you an alternative narrative or an alternative ontology, as philosophers would say, for this categorical thinking. If you think of yourself as a part of a network, and let's start from a social network, because that's something we can all probably imagine, at least after COVID. Then all the things you are, you think of how you identify yourself. Are you an assemblage of values, an assemblage of cells, assemblage of genes, assemblage of ideas, of stories, of memories? All of the things, however you identify your unique self, all of those things are things that you've gotten from others and are constantly leaving you and you're giving away to others in social contact. Like here, I am sharing with you these ideas, these thoughts of mine, but they're not my thoughts really. They're just thoughts that have emerged in me based on what other thoughts I've been exposed to whom I have been talking to. And it's like a cocktail. I've just mixed you this cocktail of ideas, and I'm serving it to you. And it's going to hopefully influence you so that then you will serve it further in your own form. And in that way, because all the things that makes us unique are actually, you can think of not as unique like you possess some sort of unique essence you got from birth, because you didn't. We're all kind of hollow and empty in the end. But our uniqueness is like uniqueness of a crossroads. It's the uniqueness of a location, uniqueness of a position in a network of contacts. So I can be different from you because my position in this network is different. I'm exposed to different ideas from you, and that's why I have something to give to you. We don't have the same exact ideas. And in that way, I can identify as something that is neither separate, neither a category, but also not the other extreme, which I often hear in hippie circles referring to as we are all one, we are just this big Gaia porridge where everything is just the same mash. Well, that's kind of uninspiring too, because I see a lot of structure, a lot of difference in this world. I don't see everything being the same. I see everything being connected. And that's why networks provide this amazing and quite simple metaphor to identify, in that we can see ourselves as part of something larger, but still as unique parts of it. And because of this identifying as a node in a network, as a crossroads, as a certain position, because of this, you also might actually have some power over how much you die. Because whatever you have, be it ideas or just gut microbes or cells or memories or whatever you possess, what is your unique set of elements, the more you give them away, the less you die, because more of you is then living in the network. And the more you keep them to yourself, the more you will die when you die, the more you will take with you, the more Jesus Christy it becomes in the Well, that's a kind of bad metaphor because he kind of didn't die in the end. But like the more of a tragedy it becomes in a way. And I want to emphasize this because I think this is a hopeful narrative, and we're here in the House of Science and Hope. But it's not hopeful in the toxic sense of hope, and I don't like toxic hope. You know, like the kind of hope where we just sit at home and think like maybe everything will just be fine, even though probably things are going shit outside and we should really act now. So not that kind of hope, but more the kind of hope that, hey, maybe already the way we exist here holds a tremendous amount of power. If we can just learn to see these invisible structures, we can then use them to carry responsibility together, for example. Because as soon as we become network beings, it totally changes the way we think about things like power, like responsibility, like birth, like death, like identity. Suddenly, it's not an individual responsibility. It's not you have individual power. Suddenly, you can carry power, carry responsibility as a network. Suddenly, you can use power as a network. Suddenly, your power as an individual becomes really just the power of choosing where exactly you are in the network and what you let through and what you don't. And you become this kind of rewiring part of this big circuit board. And that can be quite empowering because it can allow us to tap into the huge resource of life that so often stays invisible when we just focus on separate individuals and so on. And this kind of thinking is based on philosophical tradition called process ontology. And the philosophical kind of descendant of it that I have with a couple of friends tried to develop from process ontology called network ontology. And in all of its simplicity, what it states is that instead of individual ontologies, so kind of stories or like ways of understanding the world through categorical individuals, we think that if that's me, if like I don't identify actually like as a static little person with a purse, but actually I am a wave in time. So instead of saying I am Aura Raulo, maybe I should have introduced myself like I am Aura Raulo on this day of February. I'm this one stage of Aura Raulo, very different from what Aura Raulo was 5 years ago, or probably very different what they will be in 5 years from now. So I can only speak for myself and not for the previous versions of myself. That's a really good way of getting away from responsibility in court. But in addition to being like a one generation long process, we are also an evolutionary process. So we carry in our being, in the shape of our body, in our fears, our lusts, our senses of meaning, we carry the imprint of our ancestors' life. So we might think we are somehow independent thinkers, but we're not. When we look at this world, whatever we label meaningful or meaningless, whatever we label beautiful or ugly or scary or safe, is dependent on these internal compasses we have inherited from our ancestors, of course also from our personal experience to some extent, but also a lot from our ancestors, of which some of them weren't even human. So we're still carrying the fear of, for example, do you know this, what is called the fear of holes? How many of you have a fear of weird holes? Okay, just one. Usually there's so many people. There's like this well-known fear of like geometric holes. And we know that we have that fear because something scary like that happened to our ancestors, featuring holes somewhere. But that thing itself is long gone and left no memory. So we don't know what it is. Was it a beast? Was it a disease? Was it an alien? Who knows? But we carry the fear within us as a species. And the same way we carry the ideas of what is sexy. We carry the ideas of what is beautiful. And we might think that we have very personal taste, but to some extent there is also a very, very long, ancient background on that. But in addition to these temporal, time-spanning processes, we are also, at this very moment, we are part of a social system. We're part of a social network. And we're all unique, as I said, unique nodes in a social network. And also part of an ecological network. We consume other species, they consume us. We work together with other species, they work with us. We form symbiosis and we have enemies and friends. And all of this creates a huge network of impacts with all the other species on the planet, where no one is isolated. So there is, just like that there's this story of like every human in the planet is like 6 steps away from each other in Facebook or something. Well, similarly, every species on this planet is like 6 steps away from you as a species. So even the rarest species of moss somewhere in the middle of a rainforest in Amazon can be influenced by what you eat or whom you interact with indirectly through these steps in this ecological network. So taking this, maybe we should stop worrying about our individual worries, individual death and individual responsibility, and start thinking, what can we do if we see ourselves truly as a part of a network, as a part of a system? And the power we all have is to ask ourselves, what is our position in our network, ecological or social, and what does it mean? So I'm going to show you one example, but there's many different examples you could think of in different kinds of networks. So if we all think of what kind of a position we have in our social network, we can use these tools from network theory to characterize our position. We can, for example, say we can be cliquey. So we can have high transitivity or high eigenvector centrality. These are fancy words that mean that you sit in the middle of a clique, which in other words means that many of your friends are friends with each other. So you're exposed to others who are also exposed to others. Or you can be bridgy, which means you connect otherwise disconnected parts of the network, which in other words means your friends are not friends with each other, that you're exposed to others who are not exposed to each other. And that can be described with high betweenness or high bridge propensity. I just wanted to put these words here because I think they're quite poetic. I really like betweenness. It's very lovely. Eigenvector centrality is maybe not that poetical, but anyway, so you can think like people I know, do they all know each other? Or do they know people that know each other? Or am I maybe sitting in a bridgy position? Like, do I have like a lot of right-wing friends and left-wing friends? Or am I like part of my childhood metalhead group, but then also hanging out with this like pink disco queen scene? And then like connecting otherwise pretty disconnected. I don't know, maybe metalheads are pretty connected to the pink disco queens these days. Don't want to make any assumptions here. But basically, like, think about it. Where are you? What kind of position you are in? And then think about what kind of position is actually most enriching. So for all the things that spread in those networks, ideas and disease and healthy microbes and information and misinformation and everything. What kind of people do you think get the most diverse set, who get most enriched by their position in the network? Can you guess? Yep, right. That was good intuition right there, because I actually originally guessed this one. Because I thought like if you're like more in contact, you might get more stuff. But actually, if you contact with different kind of scenes, then of course you get more different kinds of stuff. And this is something I've actually studied in terms of gut microbiome, and that's why I put gut microbiome there. So I've been talking about like all these mind things and amazing identities and psychological things, but you also carry this mini ecosystem of bacteria inside of you, which also actually influences your mind and your personality in all kinds of creepy ways. So it's quite interesting to me to study how those bacteria spread, because they don't cause disease, they're actually really healthy for you, but the diversity of that system actually makes you really healthy and influences your stress responsiveness and your sociality and all kinds of personality traits as well. And in our research, we have found that it's the bridgy individuals who gain the richest microbiome. And then there are other people's research who have found that it's the bridgy individuals that gain the richest political ideas, for example. And it makes sense, right? And then it's these hipster kings and queens who sit in the middle of the clique who actually get impoverished by their cliquey position. So be scared of being too popular. So this is something I wish you can take home and think about, because this is something where you actually truly have a lot of power over the system, where you put yourself in a network, whose ideas you get exposed to, and who gets exposed to your ideas. If you're just telling them to a friend who already knows them, it's not going to change anything. So queer death is this concept that questions the binary nature of life and death, and asks, when we talk about death, whose death are we actually talking about? Who is the character in this story? What are the forms of life that we should be talking about in the first place? Are they separate blocks? Are they perhaps networks, nodes in a network? Are they perhaps trees of descendants or waves that span across the time, like in the process ontological view of individuality or self? Each one of those can provide a huge advantages of seeing invisible forms around you. And each one of those can also kind of, you can use it as a bit of like a mind yoga, or like I call it mind stretching practice, because it's kind of like unintuitive to think of yourself as a network or part of a network. You have to bend your mind a bit, like in yoga you have to bend yourself into some like a bit unnatural positions. And it might hurt, and it might be hard, but it makes you more flexible. And I promised it really helps you with back pain. Well, no, it helps you with the pain of existence, because it helps you see more of life. It gets you out of this like kind of simplistic bubble of thinking about life. And you start seeing things that were previously invisible. You can start seeing these little little roots that go through the room from one person to another. You start thinking about social networks as something very visible. And this is also something that happened during the pandemic. I remember when my grandmother first used the word second-order contacts, I was so proud that it's kind of popularized this idea that it's not just who you hang out with that matters, it's who they hang out with and who they hang out with and so on. So try a little mind yoga sometimes. Just sit down and think, what if I am a wave? What if I am a network? How does that change of how I feel about who I am, where I start, where I end? What's my role in here? What's my power? What's my responsibility? And I want to end this presentation because, as I said, I'm also a node in a network. All of these ideas I've shared with you today are just a cocktail and emergent little spice mix curated from ideas from others. So I wanted to share with you a few quotes from others that have inspired me, who are, I think, quite relevant for today's talk. And especially relevant for this idea that by sharing what you are, can you maybe become less mortal? Can you die less if you keep sharing all the stuff that lands in your crossroads? So first of all, Juni Sinkkonen, who is a psychologist also working here in Puistokatu, doing amazing research on like psychology, but not individual psychology, but psychology of groups and networks to deal with grief, ecological grief. Like how do we mourn for the environmental disaster together and not alone? This is a quote from Juni. Holding grief for others is being part of a web. Grieving is never individual. I experience comfort in being a vessel for others' painful emotions because I feel that is how I can serve the greater web of life. So she thinks that just by holding grief for others makes her feel more like less alone, less like an individual and more like part of a web. Then my dear friend Matan Shenhav, who is this kind of, how would I call him, roadside philosopher, maybe, said, very inspiring, already 10 years ago, when we share what we are and become aware of the otherness which lies beyond ourselves, it bursts the pretentious boundary of individuality and lets us be defined by our connections rather than our essence, like with the crossroads. And becoming aware of the utter interconnectedness of our being may actually result in a sense of unity so deep that there remains no self left to die. And I think that was really touched me when I heard him say this. And then Joanna Mathy, who is also like a thinker I found through Puistokatu, said, "This pain we feel is pain of the whole world, and if we let our heart break open, it can hold the whole world." And that's been quite inspiring for me, that when we feel disempowered, for example, because of political or environmental crisis, then we can think, okay, maybe this is an amount of trouble that an individual just can't deal with. Well, lucky thing, I'm not an individual. So if you tap into the network, if you realize you're part of a web, it's almost like, like that you can carry more weight because the web is carrying weight with you. It's literally the difference between dropping a pin on a spider or the spider web. I think the spider would get squished, but the web wouldn't. So I want to end it here and thank you all, and hope that these little insights from the scientific theory of networks and the social scientific theory of queer death will make you, if not less mortal, maybe less mortal, but also maybe less lonely in these times of separation and isolation we are living in. A lot of these thoughts were based on my work with Björn Kröger here, so if you're interested, you can also ask him. He's a paleontologist and a very wise man. We've been working in this hat project for the past 5 years. Well, you gave it to me, or maybe Indra gave it to me. He can't take any responsibility of this version of Björn Kröger who existed before. And yeah, for the final thing, I just wanted to put this little comic strip here about this exact thing about process ontology, that you've probably heard some of your more pretentious friends sometimes come up with this narrative that my whole life has been a process of becoming who I am. Well, whenever someone says that to you, you can tell them the rest of your life shall be a process of unbecoming that. Thank you.